I've been told my entire life.
Never get a down sleeping bag wet. When down gets wet, it loses its ability to insulate, becomes a giant weight, and takes forever to dry. Or at least that's what they say.
To combat this, companies have started putting potentially toxic chemicals into their down to give it a durable, water-repellent finish.
The question I have, is this really necessary?
First off, I want to clarify the down really is susceptible to water, as demonstrated by this shake test. This is the traditional test that brands use to warn us about the dangers of wet down, and then they compare it to their DWR treated down to show us just how much safer treated down can be.
But when are you ever going to stick your down sleeping bag into the creek and start aggressively agitating it? Not to mention the ratio of water to down that are in these tests.
This is less than 1 gram of down compared to 240 grams of water. That's the equivalent of me pouring 22 gallons of water onto the sleeping bag and then wondering why it got wet.
In the real world, you're dealing with a lot less water, whether it's rain getting in your pack, you fall in a creek, or most likely condensation on the inside of your tent. So I've partnered with Zimbivy to find out how susceptible untreated down really is to moisture. We devised several tests to compare treated down to untreated down and even synthetic insulation before eventually soaking my untreated down quilt in a creek and sleeping in it. And what I found will surprise you.
Okay, so before I stick my quilt in a creek, I want to do some small tests to make sure that I'm going to be safe. What I have here is the standard test to measure down fill power.
Maybe you've seen your jacket or sleeping bag talk about 600, 800, or even 900 fill power down. Those numbers are determined by sticking 28 grams of down in a cylinder like this, and then measuring how much down compresses under a precisely weighted disc.
I'm going to perform the same test comparing DWR treated down to regular untreated down, but I'm going to add progressively larger amounts of water to the down to see if it can loft even when it's wet.
I started with 1 part water to 1 part down and went all the way up to 15 parts water to 1 part down.
That's the equivalent of me pouring over 3 gallons of water onto this sleeping bag.
And even though untreated down did lose some loft with larger quantities of water, it would continue to loft. And if down can loft, it can keep you warm, at least a little bit. This begs the question, how much water can you realistically expect to get on your sleeping bag in the field?
Okay, so as I see it, there are 3 main ways your down can get wet. In the rain, falling in a creek, or condensation on your tent or even your bag. Now, when I was doing my loft test, I noticed that compressed down won't take on water. It just sort of pools on top of the compressed down. If that's true, I should be able to compress this untreated quilt in this compression stuff sack, stick it in the water, and it will not get wet.
To find out, I weighed the quilt both before and after I stuck it in the creek to see just how much water it soaks up.
Okay, here I go. An untreated compressed down quilt in the water.
But before pulling the quilt out, I dried the outside of the compression sack just like I think most people would in the field.
So far, feels dry. I see a couple drops just on the outside of the shell. And just as I thought, this quilt is bone dry, but I did compress it a little bit more than I think most people are going to. So I'm gonna back it off just a little bit, stick it back in the creek, and test it again. Okay, best I can tell, the lightly compressed down quilt only took on about 1 ounce of water.
So that's about what you could expect if you fell in a creek during a crossing, but what if you spent all day hiking in the rain? To figure this out, I stuck a loosely compressed down quilt in a backpack and I put them both in my rain chamber for 6 hours of prolonged rain, with none of my typical precautions like a rain cover or a dry bag, just a loosely compressed quilt in all-day rain.
Okay, I'm not gonna over compress it. Just about what I think is standard that most people are going to be doing when they're carrying a down bag like this. So, average compression stuff sack, untreated down, going in the pack, going in the rain chamber. And it's important to note that this is not a waterproof or DWR coated compression stuff sack.
After 6 hours, I pulled the quilt out and found it had soaked up about 24 ounces of water, or about 2 parts water to 1 part down, well below where my test started showing signs of compromised loft.
Now, the only other way I really see water getting in your quilt
is from condensation.
And I happen to know from a previous test where I slept all night in some of the most humid conditions I've ever faced that you can only realistically expect about 12 ounces of water to condense on the inside of your tent. Assuming you get at least half that on your down bag, you're still at only 6 ounces of water. Now, typically in these scenarios, I would have my down bag in a dry bag or more often wrapped in a cheap trash bag. And both the creek and the rain, that would be plenty to keep your bag dry. But even if you're being careless and not taking what I believe are the bare minimum precautions to keep your down dry,
down still doesn't want to get wet. Even if I lay this fully uncompressed quilt directly into the water, it just sort of floats on top. I have to force it down into the water to get any water in it at all. Down just isn't as susceptible to water as we've been led to believe.
But I wanted to know for sure. So before I slept under a wet down quilt, I did a few freezer tests with these custom mini quilts to see if it takes more energy to stay warm under a wet quilt than a dry quilt.
One of the things I haven't really addressed yet is that almost all down quilts and sleeping bags have a DWR coating on their outer shell. This is also true of these miniature down quilts that Zimbivvy made for me. When I try to pour water directly on top of the miniature quilt, it just pools on top thanks to the DWR coating on the shell. Now, on Zimbivvy's regular quilts, the outer shell has a DWR coating, but the inner shell does not. That means that any water that has been getting into these quilts is likely getting in through the inner material. But on these miniature quilts that have a DWR coating on the outer shell and the inner shell, I had to get creative and directly injected water into the down to see how much energy it takes to maintain 98 degrees. And because we're dealing with water, I opted to use this aquarium heating wire rather than my standard heating pad.
Just like on the loft test, I slowly added more and more water to the down and found that there was about a 45% decrease in warmth at 15 parts of water to 1 part down. But based on my test, that's way more water than you're likely to ever get in your down, even if you take no precautions to protect it. At more realistic levels, I saw less than 10 to 15% difference in performance, which gives me the confidence I need to try sleeping under a wet quilt. To maintain safety, I had a car parked nearby and waited until it was almost dark before dunking my quilt.
Okay, so this is the test that all the other tests have been leading up to. Can I spend the night in a wet down quilt that has been untreated and survive? We're gonna weigh the quilt beforehand just to see how much it weighs dry, and then we're gonna weigh it again after we pull it out of the creek to figure out exactly how much water the quilt actually has inside of it. So let's see what we got here. We're right at 25 ounces. Can you see that? Okay, so right now the temperature isn't too cold. It's about 52 degrees. We wanted to film a little bit of this while we still had some daylight. So we're gonna dunk the quilt in the creek. I'm gonna go get inside of it. The low tonight should be somewhere in the high 30s, which should be plenty cold to test whether or not the down's gonna still keep me warm without freezing the water inside the quilt. All right, this is Zimbivvy duck down, untreated, 800 fill, and it's going in the creek, and then I'm going in it. I don't know why, but it feels dumb to do this. Okay, here we go.
I realized that if this had happened to me in the backcountry, if by some unfortunate freak accident my quilt fell uncompressed in a creek, I would consider that an emergency and probably pack up and hike through the night to get out of there.
Okay, so now we're at 35 ounces, up from 25 ounces. So we got a good 10 ounces by weight of water in this quilt. Is that enough? Should we dunk it again? Just so you know, we do have a car nearby, so if this is the dumbest thing I've ever done, I can hopefully rescue myself. Let's weigh it again. 45 ounces. So that's almost 20 ounces by weight of water that is in this quilt. Quilt is wet. It's going in the tent.
To try and mimic ISO testing standards and to prevent being completely nude on camera, I opted to wear one layer of long underwear under the quilt that quickly got wet itself from the water dripping straight off the quilt. I tried to pick a night when the forecasted temperature would hit just above freezing, and the quilt itself is comfort rated for 35 degrees Fahrenheit.
It's wet. That I can tell. If the next time you see me is in the morning, you should know everything was great. But if I wake up in the middle of the night, I'll be sure to update you if I'm just feeling too cold. I just got out of the bag to go to the bathroom. I don't know what the temperature is outside, but I am wet and now I'm cold. I've been great as long as I've been in the sleeping bag, but as soon as I got out to go to the bathroom, I got pretty chilled and now I'm shivering. So it's cold enough to make me feel pretty bad when I'm not inside the sleeping bag, which means the sleeping bag is doing something to keep me warm. So I'm gonna try to go back to sleep and I'll talk to you in the morning.
But once I was back under the wet quilt, I warmed up quickly, which meant that even the wet down was working to keep me warm. But with overnight lows hitting 36 degrees Fahrenheit without me ever feeling cold or uncomfortable other than just being wet, I'm not sure this constitutes a real emergency. But I do want to say that there were a lot of factors I couldn't test for. The overnight dew point, for instance, was quite low, to the point that my quilt felt completely dry by morning. Had the overnight dew point been higher, or had it been more humid overall, or had the temperatures been more consistently cold throughout the night, I might have been pulling the plug. It's really hard to say. But what gives me confidence and what I think everyone should be doing, no matter what type of sleeping bag you have, is compressing your bag in your pack and covering it with some sort of trash bag or dry sack. If you do that, it probably doesn't matter what type of sleeping bag you have, you'll probably be okay. But what do you think? Did I do enough to test wet down, or do you think I'm crazy for suggesting anything other than a synthetic quilt to begin with? Let me know down in the comments below. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, and do all those other things. And as always, thanks for watching.